since all Baptist churches are different, and you have to deal with your polity and your bylaws and the vision of your pastor, I just wanted to highlight some things that you probably already know in terms of duties of the various organizations, various ministries. And again, if you're a part of those ministries, it's important to do the very best you can and stay in your lane. You know, you can always make suggestions, but you know, pray that God will lead somebody if it's not the way you think it should be. You know, pray that God will lead them, lead the leaders of the organization, because you're all leaders, but then there's leaders within the leadership of the ministry. In terms of the ministers, in our church we call them associate ministers. In many Baptist churches, unless they are elected an assistant to pastor, most will serve at the pleasure of the pastor. And the pastor oversees both licensed ministers and ordained ministers if they are in the church. The pastor is responsible for your training. Licensed ministers, again, Brightside's policy was you are technically only a licensed minister in Brightside. So if one of the licensed ministers under me would come to Turner, it's the pastor here's prerogative to recognize them as a minister. Now, Pastor Hampton and I are good friends. You know, for the most part, if it's a minister in Brightside, he would probably recognize them here. But I explained to them there was no obligation. You're only a minister in your own church. Now, for an ordained person, there's maybe a little more latitude. But my point really is that the authority comes from the pastor. It may be written, it may be codified, and it may be the polity of that particular church. But associate ministers understand that your duty is to assist and to help the pastor hold up his arms or her arms and serve as God would lead them to have you do. You know, if it's visitation, if it's preaching, if it's teaching a Bible study, whatever, you know, allow the Lord to use you more like Paul did with Timothy. Timothy, he was very specific, especially in 1 Timothy, as to what responsibilities were. The second ministry that I wanted to lift up, again, what you do here may be different from some other churches, but that's the ministry of deacons. Deacons are, in most churches, a spiritual order. Officers of the church that are ordained. Of course, there can be deacons in training or walking deacons, but a deacon is one, and how you're selected varies from church to church. But you are called to the diaconate, to a certain ministry, and you're, in most Baptist churches, one of two ordained officers, one being the pastor and the other being the deacons. As biblical precedent, as you're aware, it's Acts chapter 6, where in the early New Testament church, there was murmuring among the Grecian widows and the Jewish widows. And since the predominant culture in the early church was Jews, the Hellenics or the Gentile widows felt that they were being shortchanged. The apostles said, in essence, that they're too involved with prayer and the vision to stop and wait tables. So they asked for the congregation to give them names of 7 men, gave qualifications, and it turned out some of them were not Jewish, which was great. And their job was to take care of the widows and to wait tables. So my point is that deacon's ministry is a servant ministry. And as a servant leader, deacons ought to be willing to do whatever needs to be done. I don't think your role is to supervise the pastor, to direct the pastor, but to assist the pastor, work with the pastor. Now, you're also guardians of the church, and if there's some really egregious situation, I think then you consult the Holy Spirit as to what your role will be to protect the pastor, but also to protect the church, because you have a dual role there. And the other things are kind of obvious. You should be equipped by having a devoted prayer life, attend Sunday school and Bible study, be a tither, and follow the instruction of 1 Timothy chapter 3, and certainly deaconess, if you have them here, should assist the deacons and follow them and the ministry that is here. Trustees, I think in some churches it's viewed as a temporal ministry, a financial ministry, but also your job is spiritual. And I think it would be very good for you to if you haven't already, take some good courses, because financial responsibility today is changing. People who are elected to the trustee board ought to be able to be bonded. Your job is to look after the fiscal and financial resources of the church. You ought to be honest. You should make sure there's an honest accounting. At Brightside, we have had outside auditors from time to time to put the congregation at ease and to make sure the money is being used as it was designated. You have to be careful as to stay up with IRS regulations. You have to look at restrictions. If somebody gives a donation and restricts it, you're obligated by law to make sure that that's the way it's spent, and if you need to change it.
When you say restricted, what do you mean?
Okay. For instance, there's a person at Brightside who gives their offering specifically to mortgage reduction. Okay. So their money by law cannot be used to pay the light bill, pay the pastor's salary, maintain the van. It's restricted, and the only way for it to be unrestricted, and I'm saying this to you as leaders, I'm not saying you should go out and start restricting or having people restricted, but you should know legally that unless that person unrestricts their gift, most churches it won't happen, but technically, and it has happened, they could take you to court and you would have to reimburse them. I had a situation where a fellow was incarcerated. He got a settlement. His mother was the custodian of the settlement. On her own, she decided to tithe from his money. When he found out that she tithed from his money, it was a noble thing for her to do. She was a tither. He wrote to the church and said, I did not authorize my mother to give my money to the church. I demand that I be reimbursed. By law, we had to reimburse him, which we did. So I'm saying it's rare, but you can run into situations like that. And just be aware that if somebody comes and says, we had a death in the family, and in the will of the person, they're giving $5,000 You just redid your kitchen, to redo the kitchen. Well, by law, that's where it's supposed to be used, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. Does that
Question?
Yes, does that person have to give the church a written authorization that their offerings are designated for this particular ministry? I mean, do we have to have it documented some way?
Yes, there should be documentation, because then it's just what that person said or what you said. You're not gonna run into it. You probably won't run into it very often. The reason it was important to us, when we built our community center, the church was $2.6 million. We raised in the community $3.1 million to build that building. And we had naming opportunities and all that. So it was important for us to designate and spend the money where they had designated. Now, at Brightside, there is a particular fund, and I won't mention it because of the confidentiality of it, but there is a person every year from outside of the church that gives a substantial amount of money. It's a 5-figure donation, but it is restricted to a certain aspect of ministry. And the church acknowledges that restriction, sends a thank you letter pointing out that their donation is being used for that ministry and that ministry only. And the only way I think the church would ever try to use that is if it's on a last leg and it's going to close, then it's completely appropriate to go and ask that donor, can we redirect your funds because of the dire situation of the church? That person still has the option of saying yes or no. So if you have any questions, I would suggest that you consult legal counsel or maybe a CPA to know exactly, what your standing should be.
Can I have a question? Ask a question. Could that restriction?
Can you say louder?
Could that restriction be listed on like a check that was received as well? Like, could they put in the,
In their
memo
offering?
section that they wanted that restricted?
If you're saying that they can write it in the memo section?
Yes.
Yes.
That they wanted. it
Yeah, I mean,
restricted for
it's
certain
recorded.
ministry? Okay,
And if you see it, I mean, it's right there in writing.
right,
And they can say, well, you saw it. Now, I'm not an attorney,
right.
and I
Thank you.
don't try to give legal advice, only going by what our experience has been. However, that having been said, I don't think you should encourage your congregation
Oh, no.
Right,
to
right.
restrict a lot of, because then it'd be hard for the church to function. But I'm just saying, be aware that if it comes up, you have to try to know how to deal with it. Because at Brightside, in the early years, we did, we were very public about our ministry. We were community oriented, we're still they just received from the government a $500,000 grant to upgrade the facility. And when people heard that we were trying to be of a blessing to the community, people would send us, people would send $5,000 checks, $10,000 checks. And sometimes they would restrict them and sometimes they would not. So we had to be meticulous about how we treated the funds. Because in a small town, people talk. And if they found out we were not doing what we said we would do, what's that? The result of that would be people wouldn't want to give us because they wouldn't trust us. The other job of trustees, of course, you oversee the property, make sure it's maintained. Insurances are important. Make sure your insurances are up to date. I'm telling you stuff you already know. However, and also, along with your deacons or whoever else is responsible, security is very important today. You know what's happening with churches. You know people come into your church that they don't know who they are. Be intentional about being security oriented. We have a special counting room at Brightside for the offerings, 98% of the congregation has no idea where it is, and they should not know. We have cameras in there. You know, trustees are saved. We want to keep them saved. But my point is, you know, you're handling funds that are not yours, and treat them as such. Make sure your church is immaculate. My pastor in New York used to tell his folks, treat your church the way you treat your houses. He said till he went to one of their houses. He said, treat your church like it's God's house. So that's important. Another big area is to be able to have a safe church when it comes to youth.
Amen.
Make sure, and I can't be any more emphatic than this, that you have your clearances up to date. Everybody, all the officers, in my opinion, again, Mrs. Butcher, you guys do what you want, should have clearances, at least a criminal background check. If you came from someplace else, or you're going to be dealing with funds, you should have an FBI check. But if you know, but for sure, if you're dealing with youth, have a child clearance. It protects the church.
Yeah.
It protects you as an individual. Is Turner Incorporated?
It is incorporated, yes.
Okay. You don't have to be a 501c3, but for your protection, you should be incorporated, meaning that it lessens any personal liability for things that might happen in your church. Again, Pastor, these are some things to think about. If you don't have professional liability, in addition to general liability, look into that. If you don't have D&O for your senior officers, like your deacons and your trustees, D&O is directors and omissions insurance. The premiums are not very high. In other words, just look into, and you may not need it here, just look into everything, because we live in a very litigious society now. People will sue you if you look at it wrong. And you've got to protect your church and protect yourself. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just saying, you know, a word to the wise. So the child clearances, your own and your own background checks and clearances, very helpful. And it also, when your congregation knows that you've taken those extra steps, again, I think they'll feel comfortable about giving more to your church. The last thing is your auxiliaries. You know, to me, that's again, it's a matter of being faithful. How you do your auxiliaries is completely up to the policy of your church. And again, where there's skills like singing and ushering, just understand that not everybody is as gifted as somebody else, and you may have to be patient with them and work with them, so that everybody wins. To me, one of the joys of when I was at Brightside, you know, I loved coming to church. I enjoyed being there. I enjoyed it when it was up. I enjoyed it when it was down. And people will notice you, and if you feel like, even on bad days, if you feel like, thank God I'm in the house of the Lord, be able to intercede for other folks, they'll be able to tell when you seem to be enjoying Turner, and no local church is perfect, and you say, God, I thank you that I'm a part of Turner. It's a Memorial
Yes, sir.
Baptist Church. You know, because day by day we're getting better. Every round goes higher. And There'll be some good days, some bad days. Now, if things are not going well here, the street can't change that. If somebody's hurting your feelings, 5 other people ain't gonna change that. The Bible speaks of the fact you should go to that person
That's right.
and say, you hurt me. I'd say most of the time, people, most people don't even know they hurt you. And, get that thing reconciled and work through it. Because your church will be blessed and you will be blessed. So summary, yes.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
You mentioned in terms of bylaws, you said at the Brightside Church, they, while you were pastor, they reviewed the bylaws, you said every 2 years?
Annually.
Annually?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Well, Brightside was not organized quite like, I'd say more traditional Baptist churches. We used what we call a minister center concept. And there was a ministry center that covered every aspect of church life. For instance, there was outreach ministry that did outreach. There was education that looked at Sunday school, Bible study, and so forth. There was youth. There were support services. They made sure that all the annual days and so forth were taken care of. But there was discipleship. They made sure that all the new members got trained and all that. But there was also an order ministry. And under order ministry were all the aspects of keeping the church compliant. They didn't do the trustees' work, but they helped the trustees and made sure what the trustees were doing was compliant with government. They didn't do the deacons' work, same thing there. But one of their major jobs was to maintain the bylaws as a functional document. And again, the order ministry meets on a monthly basis, and they make sure, for instance, and haven't been there for 7 years, but we had church meeting on the annual church meeting, the second Saturday in December. And again, I don't want you guys to say, well, they were doing it. If you don't do it, that's fine. I'm just saying what we did. You asked.
Yes, sir.
So in our bylaws, it said that I and the administrative team had to post the church meeting agenda 2 weeks on the bulletin board, 2 weeks prior to the church meeting. So nobody is broadsided or blindsided. They know what's going to be discussed. If something comes up, then it has to be explained at the church meeting. We even went to the point where people could not get a copy of the budget for the following year, but they could come in and sit with a trustee and look over the budget. They couldn't get a copy. That's just the way we operated, but all of that was in the bylaws. It kept us on our toes, because if we didn't put the agenda up, it could be challenged at the church meeting. And there's enough stuff to be challenged about at the church meeting. But we felt like it was important to follow the rules. When the leadership followed the rules, then we had some sway to say to the congregation, you ought to be following the rules. It wasn't do as I say. It was do as I say and as I do. Now, again, I'm saying this was our principle. Did it happen 100% of the time? No, but we tried to live by those bylaws. When the bylaws were done, we tried to examine them and make sure they were consistent with the Word of God. Even in church discipline, which was part of what the deacons did to help the pastor, we went by Matthew 18 and make sure people. We never had to. In my time, we never had to expel or excommunicate anybody from the church. But we did get to the final step, where the next step was to take the person in front of the church, which is a grueling, potentially humiliating situation. It was settled before that happened. But would we have done it? Yeah, because that's what we're committed to do.
Excuse me, I have another question on the bylaws. Our bylaws are currently quite outdated.
Oh,
What
what?
is your-
Outdated?
Yeah, quite
Yeah.
outdated. What is your recommendation for the process that we need to follow to get them up to date and current?
Okay, again, you gotta follow the leader. Asking me what I would do, I would ask, I would say, form a bylaws committee. It doesn't have to be, is it okay to say these things?
Yes, sir, yes, sir.
It doesn't have to be a standing committee, it could be what's called an ad hoc committee for the sole purpose of updating the bylaws. If I were you, I would get one or two bylaws from churches that are up to date. And then go article by article. As a matter of fact, it's not just good polity and practice. Since you are a nonprofit organization, God forbid that you would have to close up. The government is specific about how the assets of your church are liquidated. In other words, if you say as a last resort, we're gonna sell Turner Building, and deacon's gonna take half, and trustees are gonna take a third, and the pastor's gonna get a cut. No, you can't. You are an incorporated in the state of Pennsylvania. You're an incorporated, not that you guys would, but you're incorporated in the state of Pennsylvania, and you have to have a clause that's it's usually the last article. It's called dissolution. You have if your corporation dissolves, what is the disposition and distribution of your assets? In that, you ought to say something like, you know what you're going to do with it. It's going to be donated to another church. It's going to be donated to another 501c3. Or it's going to be donated for missions, whatever. Now, if you don't, guess what happens? The courts come in and decide distribution. So that's just law. So it's so much better to pray it through and think it through with your bylaws. Bylaws don't have to be a long, drawn out, legalistic thing. But it ought to be a guide that is tethered to the Word of God. So you as officers ought to know what's in the bylaws. Now, bylaws are imperfect. Once you get them going, you have a procedure to approve them, you make them available to the congregation. Invariably, somebody will see something that maybe shouldn't be there, or something that should be there. And then once you're settled on it, you prayed through it, you adopt them, but there ought to be a clause also that says this is how they can be amended. And that's why Brightside does a yearly evaluation. End of the year, like with the insurance policies, good to go. Good to go. However, if something came up during the year, we may have to amend the bylaws. And then it goes through a procedure and it ends up at church meeting and they vote on it. Or if it happens to be something that's during the year, there's specific instructions on how that is handled. If somebody comes back at you at the church, they take you to court. Why did you do what you did? Well, it's protection. I say, well, it's not something we just thought up. Article 3, paragraph 6 says this is how we do it here at Turner. And in this particular case, that's how we did it. It doesn't totally indemnify you, but the court will say to the plaintiff, did they follow the bylaw? Yeah. So what's your argument? It's just good, good stewards of God's resources. People are your resources. buildings resources, money are your resources. And the better you can protect yourself in a society like we live in, the better off you are.
Any other questions? Any other questions?
The question. And it's
You gotta
back-
speak up a little bit.
I have a question that was back before we got to this point, before we took our last break. When it
Say what she's saying for me.
When it comes to like communion, for members that can't, that are not able to be here, like we have a couple of seniors that are like
We can't hear you.
I can't hear.
She has, she's asking about communion and members that aren't able to physically come here.
right, like our two seniors.
Yes.
How does that get resolved? Who's able to go and actually give communion? Does it have to be a deacon or a deaconess, or how does that get resolved? Oh,
That's a pastor question, that one.
Traditionally, ordained clergy and deacons are the only ones that can distribute communion. Any other questions?
Let me just add this, about the importance of bylaws. Quick example, there was a church that had a lot of problems, and I was called with my team to go and try to help them work through it. They did not have an active church membership registry. And so when it came time for a vote, everybody and their brother, people who hadn't been there 15 years, came back to vote. Now, the question was asked, who is an active member of your church? And somebody said, he ain't no member. She ain't no member. And the question was, how do you know? You have no standards. Now, when I left, for my successor, Reverend was there, we said, today, back in the day, I heard her say communion, people, if they miss a certain number of communions and so forth. Today, some people may be listening online, they contribute financially, they never have set foot in the church. Maybe some people are shut in, maybe some people for work, because of work, they miss communion. But when they were getting ready to vote for a new pastor, they set up a rule. They said, okay, in order to be considered a member in good standing to vote, you had to be financial for 6 months. What does that mean? Do you have to tithe? No, you have to be financial. So if Sister Rachel puts in her tithes every month, $500 for 6 consecutive months, she's financial, she's eligible to vote. She's an active member. If Brother Fred can only afford $2, but he puts his $2 in every month, he's financial and he's recorded on the list. Now, Pastor was there. So when it came time to vote, they had the list, and those were active members. And before folks could come in the sanctuary where they took the vote, their name had to be checked off. It wasn't how much they gave. It was the fact that they were willing to record either name on a check or an envelope that they gave, or through social media, through PayPal or whatever. Now, Pastor, I threw $100 in the plate every week, cash. Where's the record? I didn't record it. So now, at least you have some idea, and that's not the only way to do it, but some way to have a record of who's an active church member. Because if you ever go to borrow money on the church, they want to know what's your active church record. There's just a whole lot of reasons to figure out how to do it. I'm not saying that the way we did it is necessarily the right way or the only way. I'm just saying in 2024, things have changed. And you gotta, be in position to protect yourself. I used to work for a guy who said, I trust everybody and I trust nobody. So,
And to follow up on that, that's a conversation I've had with many pastors, is how do you figure out who's a member? Because there's some people that watch online that don't come in the building. And I don't want to reduce membership to just financial, but as he said, I don't know any other way to do it.
and you're not dictating, if you did financial, that's the whole point. We did not try to judge people's financial status. If they gave 500, fine. If they gave $1 a month, and most people can afford $1 a month, and borrow $1, but they did it for the 6 months leading up to the election, and they put it in their envelope, they are an active member.
I
Now,
have
do
one
it-
question.
Yes, sir.
So if a person only gives like 600 every 6 months, does that still make them active?
Yeah, the idea was, it wasn't even the finance that we were worried about. It was trying to figure out a way to determine who is an active member. And we don't have sign-ins in our church. Most churches don't. Some white church, some white folks. Some of our sister churches that happen to be not us, they actually have a sign-in. And and they're specific. And that's the way they judge whether you're an active member. And you're not there, But with black churches, first of all, most of our folks ain't gonna sign in. Ain't your business. I go, okay. So how am I gonna record whether you are an active member, whether you're engaged in any way? And what we figured out was, and you don't have to do it that way, but at least we were able to have a record that this person was interested enough in the church and some couldn't get to the building, but they would either pay it online, or they would, mail in their check, or they would, drop it in the offering. Now, does that mean we love them more than we love anybody else? No. And does it mean that somebody has to do it? No. If they go to the hospital and they say they're a member of Brightside, we're still going to visit them. But when it comes down to something like voting, and even if you had, again, it goes back to the bylaws, dissolution of your building, or no, let me say it differently. Suppose you wanted to acquire property or sell property that's not the church. There should be a mechanism whereby the majority, and in our church, it's 2/3 of active members in attendance can decide to liquidate assets or purchase assets. It goes right back to, well, who's eligible? And if it's, I thought I saw her a couple of times in church, or maybe he was, but how do you determine? You gotta have some mechanism.
I don't want to get hung up here. Our current bylaws say you have to take the Lord's Supper, can't miss more than 3 Lord's Suppers in a row, and $10 a month. So when Brightside was voting, can I come in with $60?
No.
Or I have to give $10 every month?
Yeah, if that's what your bylaws,
Yeah.
because it said 6 consecutive months.
Okay.
And so, some of like if I joined last week, I couldn't come in and vote. Case in point, again, I don't, tell me when to quit. But all of these are real situations. It was a church, it wasn't Baptist, but it was African American. The church was doing kind of okay, but the people were getting older and they weren't enthusiastic. This, again, true story. One Sunday, 2 saints from outside, visitors, came in and were on fire for the Lord. Everything Pastor said, I'm telling a little bit different, but everything Pastor said, amen. When doors were open, they joined the church. Pastor was elated. Over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, onesies and Tuesdays, true story, people came in, joined the church. All of a sudden, church is growing, these new saints are just enthusiastic. Until actually they got a majority. It wasn't that big of a church, but they actually got a majority. The next Sunday, a bishop shows up. Those were his people. Now, in Baptist churches, how do you make decisions? Majority rules. And the new guy was ready to call a church meeting, have a vote the pastor out, vote him in. So the pastor went to the association, said, what should we do? Said, well, we got to go and you got to get this guy out of here. My point is, we say things like that can never happen. But if, Pastor, there was going to be a big vote on something substantial, now, if there's a renegade group, they could go out and get family members, friends. Next Sunday, they join your church. And the vote is going to be in 3 weeks. Now, if you don't have a mechanism, are they members of your church? Yeah. But are they eligible to vote? If you have no standard, what stops them? But so you may say 3 months consecutive. You may say 7 months consecutive. You may use some other means, but you have to have something measurable where you and your leadership can say, we're protecting the church. We're protecting you. We're protecting them. There ought to be some standard because people go to court now. And the court's going to want to know, how can you substantiate what you say? I don't think we have to be overly legalistic, but you have to be prudent.
Okay.
Amen.
Well,
That's me.
can we help me appreciate Pastor Butcher one more time?